What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. As much fun as it can be to talk about which Pokémon is the best, or even which gym leaders could win in a fight, maybe the most common comparisons that are made in the world of Pokémon are the generations themselves. Regions to some extent, but today I will be talking about the generations as a whole. This means not only the new opening games, but any sequels or third versions, as well as remakes that might be included. And even side games or anime content, or really anything that was in the real world at the time, because that does factor into how people receive a generation. So I figured I would rank all the generations from worst to best now, since we're at the official end of one, and I'd rather not rate Gen 9 half finished. And then maybe we'll revisit it once Gen 10 comes to an end and see if things have changed all that much. I know that most people out there will not agree on this, but that's fine because it is my list. So go ahead and tell me your rankings in the comments and we can start a cool dialogue. So, here are the rankings of every generation of Pokémon to date. Number 8, Gen 5. Okay, now that a big chunk of people have already left in rage, let me explain myself. I said worst earlier, but that's not entirely fair, it's more like least favorite, since even a bad Pokémon game has a pretty high floor. As for Gen 5 specifically, I will say the creative choice to make a full-blown sequel was astounding, and has yet to be properly duplicated to this day, so full credit where it's due. But the creative choice to do a hard reboot was less commendable. I know some people praise the idea, and while good in theory, it doesn't quite make it over the bar in execution. When, if you ask me, X and Y pulled off the reboot angle way better without trying nearly as hard. And actually this problem is twofold. The fact that only new Pokémon were allowed until you beat the game means that they basically designed a number of Pokémon twice. And while that works in this one scenario, it means that for the rest of time there will be redundancies in the decks. And that's really saying something when we get the same roles filled almost all the time as is. Additionally, the cutoff of any familiar characters or monsters makes this whole endeavor end up feeling like a fan-made Pokémon clone game. And not even a bad fan game, mind you, but it's still hard to buy this as an officially licensed product. This hasn't helped that, in my view, the graphics for Gen 5 are worse than the ones that were before it on the same system, and it just makes it difficult for me to get into these games. Not to mention the anime was the absolute worst it's ever been. I don't want it to sound like I hate Unova, I don't. It's got some amazing Pokémon designs when they decide to do their own thing, and certain aspects of the story are really cool. And hey, they brought in Infinite TM, so you gotta love that. But they released these games right around the 3DS coming out. So I don't know if they suffer from hardware limitations or just disinterest from the people in charge who wanted to play with the newer toys. I'm sad to say, despite their ideals of a grand Pokémon experience, the truth is that they made a pretty convincing approximation of one. But that's no small feat because rival companies have been trying to do that for decades. Number 7, Gen 3. I really wanted this one to be higher on the list, but when looking at everything else, it got harder and harder to justify. Gen 3 was a weird time in Pokémon. It marked a shift both in the games and the fans. For the games, this was the infamous chasm that did not allow transfers from the Game Boy games to Generation 3. The only time this has happened to date, actually. But if you could get past that, Ruby and Sapphire were actually pretty enjoyable. For my money, Hoenn has the best decks of any Pokémon region. They just brought in so many home runs. Even the random ones that you don't think about much are cool in their own way. Then of course these games got upgraded with Emerald and blew everyone's socks off. At least that's what I hear. I've never actually had a copy, or even met anyone with a copy. But the good couldn't last because Fire Red and Leaf Green also came out. And while maybe not bad per se, it was a bit of a letdown that the fourth ever pair of Pokémon games were redos of ones that they already made. Granted, it did make sense because of the cutoff thing that we said earlier, but even the new parts weren't all that great. And as I said, this was a time when a huge chunk of people dropped out of Pokémon, making it a lot harder to be open about your devotion to the series. I do think if you were able to maintain it, that this was actually a hugely rewarding time, because you got what I feel like was the best run of the anime, still produced by the original team, as well as excellent side content like Colosseum and Gale of Darkness. Not to mention the takeoff of the whole genre of Mystery Dungeon. Those kinds of experiments were exciting, even if the main games were the same as before, yet somehow less vibrant. Most people consider Gens 1 and 2 the golden age of Pokémon, being at the height of its popularity. But I would consider Gen 3 the start of the golden Pokémon experience, where the Hoenn sprites could still inspire the imagination, and all the external facets of the franchise start to culminate in something remarkable. Except for those remakes. It's just a shame that experience was so isolating because Pokémon just wasn't cool anymore. Number 6. Gen 1. Yes, Gen 1 started it all, and sometimes that's enough. But you can only coast so far on nostalgia when your product is this broken. It's no secret that the original Kanto games are filled with more bugs than Viridian Forest. And some of them were fun, like catching a Mew without having to drive to another state, or even multiplying your items, but others would just break the game entirely, deleting all of your save data. If you ask most fans about Pokémon designs, people can agree that the Gen 1 roster is incredibly solid. Not perfect, none of them are, but for the first outing, these creatures were a spectacular gradient of cute to cool to intimidating, all unified with a signature art style. It's just such a shame that the sprites messed it up by being so weird. And don't say that it's just a programming constraint, because some of them look fine, while others look like they've never even seen the concept art. Honestly, these days people are probably getting tired of Gen 1 because of the repeated pandering, but that's today's problem. You can't blame the 90s for that. But speaking of the 90s, that was the time to be alive. If you were a Pokémon fan, the entire world was taken over. It was on everything. I can't even really think of a great comparison today. Nothing really seems as ubiquitous, with all of the kids watching the show and buying the cards even without knowing how to play. And yes, this Pokémania, as it's called, is why despite the games being lackluster now, Gen 1 is still above the others. That being said, the Gen 1 games are not lacking in fun. They're the foundation of the addictive gameplay loop that Pokémon is built on, so it's still a good time even if it's clunky and slow. Booting up Red version and traversing those early routes always takes me back to the time when I could only watch others play. But if you weren't there, it'll be a lot harder for Gen 1 to grab and keep your attention. Number 5. Gen 8. It's a little out of left field for most people, I'm sure, but I'm gonna stick up for Gen 8 a bit. Not for Sword and Shield, no, but for Gen 8 as a whole, I think it has merit. If you liked Sword and Shield, then good on you, I'm not here to take away from that. But can you at least see why many people find it to be a bit empty and linear? It just bums me out that this was the impression millions of people got from Pokémon because these games were somehow ridiculously profitable. They outsold every other Pokémon game besides Gen 1. So this is likely what Pokémon will look to when trying to replicate future success. And the DLC didn't help with that. I mean, it did, it brought in a bunch of other things that the games really needed to be fleshed out, but that's the problem. They should have been fleshed out before they hit shelves. I know it's almost pointless to say, but I hope that DLC to fix all the holes that you left is not the norm in the future. That being said, we also got Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and I know a lot of people were disappointed in these for being too faithful remakes and not changing anything, but I don't really care. They were fun enough for me that they're not a detraction from the generation like the Galar games. And plus, that's not really true either, because they have fairy types now, they brought in Pokemon following you, and a whole new cavern system in the underground. I think the art style just makes people overlook the good parts. But of course, a huge reason this gen is as high as it is comes from Pokemon Legends Arceus. This game is phenomenal fun, and it brought in like 60 different things that Pokemon enthusiasts were clamoring for from all corners of the fandom. This game alone dragged the rest of Gen 8 kicking and screaming up to this spot on the list. But even Arceus did have help from side games from this era, such as Switch Mystery Dungeon and the fact that they made a brand new Pokemon Snap. You have Gen 8 to thank for that amazing game, so you can't say that it's all bad. When you look at it, there is the bad and there's also the great, which just balances out to be average. so really Gen 8 is the definition of a mixed bag. Number 4. Gen 2. This one probably sits a little low for a lot of people, but there's no shame in that. Did you hear all the nice things I said about the other ones? Yeah, Gen 2 beats that. Originally, I was gonna have it even lower, but with the eShop closures, I had to download Gold and Crystal before they were gone, and just playing them again merits a promotion. Say what you will about the Pokemon roster. Sure, there's some awesome ones that remain fan favorites to this day, but there were just as many random ones that were just round, cute mons to fill up the decks. Whatever you think of that, Generation 2 added so many mechanics that would become cornerstones of the franchise. Breeding is the first obvious one, which also allowed for the creation of new Pokemon relations from Gen 1. There's also hold items, which literally changed the game and battle, the day-night cycle creating a wider variety of Pokemon to catch on a single route, shiny Pokemon providing a reward for extensive play, and of course let us not forget the 2 new types they also threw in the mix as well. So yes, these games are also very old in comparison to most others and can be hard for newer fans to get into, but at least this time around there's actual color, and they don't feel quite as awkward to play as Gen 1. But speaking of, Gen 2 is still the only generation to date where every game allowed us to travel 2 regions, and taking us back to Kanto for the post-game. That does sort of make up for the fact that the Johto games were the only ones in this generation, since they're a twofer, but Johto has such nice personality in areas like Ecruteak and Violet City, not to mention the unique Pokeballs that are just from this region. Gen 2 being so long ago does make it limited, and despite pushing those limitations to the breaking point, it does mean that I can't put it any higher on my list, because the games of this era just have certain drawbacks, even if those games are usually a good time to play. Number 3. Gen 7. I did this list a long time ago back when Gen 7 first came out, and at that time it was at number 2. So this is a step down, but not very far, so let's dive in. Alola was just about everything fans wanted at the time, because it shook up the Pokemon formula in a big way. Gyms? Gone. Now there's trials, which are unique puzzles that reflect the captain's personality and help to flesh out the region as you explore the depths of nature. Not only was the island theming gorgeous and a fun change of pace, but it allowed a shift in overall design, with each island having its own character, and the Pokemon themselves have their own unique aesthetic. Even if some of them are weird, the majority of them feel natural in the region with bright colors and fun designs. This was also the first time that the overworld characters matched the in-battle models, so we finally have a fully integrated game. So then what's the problem? Well, it was nice the first time, but doing it again didn't capture the same magic. Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon came out 1 year after the originals, and there was some cool stuff in there like the whole Rainbow Rocket post-game, and even the Ultra Wormholes that let you catch legends and shinies, but the rest of the game was not nearly different enough to warrant buying it so soon after the first. So many people got turned off by it. If you only played the Ultra games, then I'm sure you had a good time, but doubling up at full price left many people feeling betrayed. However, Gen 7 was not over, because we also got Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. These games were not without their controversy as well, with the Too Faithful remake complaints and Kanto yet again, but just forget that for a second, and you've got a fun Pokemon experience. Sure, there was a severely limited roster, but that allowed this to be the first Pokemon game to show them fully in the overworld, even as shinies. And the emphasis on capturing Pokemon has never been done in this way outside of Go itself, which created a nice branch for many new players to come in. But there's more on that later. I understand why some people might not like Let's Go, but I find it to be one of the best Pokemon experiences that you could want on the Switch. So that, plus at least one version of the Alola games, makes for a positive generation on the whole. And hey, if nothing else, they got rid of HMs, so we can appreciate that. Number 2. Gen 6. This might be an even more unpopular opinion than putting Gen 5 at the bottom, but I truly value what Gen 6 has contributed to the Pokemon franchise, and you should too. X and Y were the first 3D Pokemon games, and even if you played Stadium-style content, this was a huge step up. Sure, we're kind of tired of the same models being used almost 10 years later, but that's not Gen 6's fault, and they mostly looked pretty good. It was sort of a letdown that there were so few new Pokémon, but that let them focus on the quality, because you can easily find 2 teams worth of favorites from Kalos. And the region itself was brilliantly realized, with lots of detail that could never have been done before, with all sorts of angles and perspective shifting. Say what you will about some of the gym puzzles, but at least they finally allowed us to move up and down in a Pokémon game. But Gen 6 also allowed significant improvements to the gameplay itself, with the best interconnectivity of any generation to date with the PSS, letting you share with other players easier than ever before. Also, this is where Pokémon Ami started, which made each Pokémon special with you getting to play with them like never before, and was even a new way to evolve Eevee into the brand new Fairy option. The Fairy type was much needed for balancing out the rest of the type chart. And is it too much to ask for roller skates back? Those were really fun. But of course, Kalos isn't perfect. It does have very little post-game, and the limiting fact that there was only ever one iteration of the region for us to experience. But at least the anime was truly great during this time. However, Gen 6 had even more to offer with Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I thoroughly enjoyed these games. Bringing the Hoenn region to the modern day was a blast, to see it in such vibrant color, even including a post-game Emerald story. And yeah, there was no battle frontier, but get over it. We got to fly around the region on a legendary and explore never-before-seen areas. And also, Mega Evolution? Yeah, you know your precious Megas? That was all done in Gen 6, with even more being added in Oros. So for everybody complaining that Gen 9 needs to bring back Megas, you can thank this generation for that. I know some people will disagree, but you can't tell me in good faith that Kalos is emptier than Galar. In fact, it has the opposite problem, with too much being packed in before the second gym. But even that's not all, because Gen 6 also saw the launch of Pokémon Go. This was the second biggest cultural impact that Pokémon has ever had. The closest they have ever come to recapturing the worldwide magic of the 90s. It seems like everybody tried this out at least once. That, combined with the first ever 3D Pokémon experience and the excellent fun of the Hoenn remakes, puts Gen 6 right up there for me. Number 1. Gen 4. For those keeping track, this was obvious, and for longtime viewers it might have been even more obvious. I loved the Sinnoh games. They were the first ones that I had the privilege to own. So after being a Pokemon fan for so long, they did not disappoint. I didn't even care how slow the graphics were. I thought that the story was well paced and the region had some great new environments. As for the Dex, Sinnoh brought in some amazing new Pokemon that still rank in most anyone's top 5, along with a bunch of new evolutions to past Pokemon that really needed some sprucing up. So it was good all around. Sinnoh has also had decent praise for actually challenging trainer battles, and a worthy post-game with an entire extra island to explore. But I can acknowledge that not everyone sees Diamond and Pearl the way that I do, so luckily they made Platinum. This solved a bunch of the problems that folks had with the first ones, and is pretty universally agreed to be a great Pokemon game, adding in a bunch of extra things to sweeten the deal. So if that doesn't make Gen 4 sound good enough, we've got Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These are considered by many to be their favorite Pokemon games ever made, and I count myself among them. Traveling the Johto region with 10 years of improved graphics and mechanics was amazing, and letting the region breathe in a way that it never could before, while also adding spots that previously didn't exist, like the brand new Safari Zone. Not to mention, once again, going back to Kanto to face those leaders and help fill out the Gen 4 National Dex even more. But it's not just a rehash, because Heart Gold and Soul Silver introduced a photo mode that let you archive your team throughout your journey, also having a permanent running shoes toggle for constant use. And of course, bringing in the concept of your Pokemon following you. Not just Pikachu, all of the Pokemon that you could possibly have will trail after your every step, with the slight exception of a few that are just too big for indoor use. And they even appear as shiny when they follow you. It's just so satisfying to run around with your friends and battle with what feels like a perfect interface. Even with the out-of-whack leveling curve the Johto region has, that just means your Pokémon will stay relevant for the entire duration of the game. If you're not getting it, I don't know that I can adequately explain the joy of playing a Gen 4 game, so I hope you can get a hold of one. Diamond and Pearl were produced as being the ultimate Pokémon games in mind, and it shows with the inclusion of everything like double battles, Pokemon contests, and more. And adding the modern sensibilities to the Johto and Kanto regions made for an amazing generation, actually making it the first time that I bought both versions at the time of release. And to ensure that they could make this the definitive epics they wanted, they delayed these games. Sure, it stung at first, but can you imagine them having the humility to admit they need more time today? And this led to the best build-up of any Pokemon generation to date. With so much extra time, the anticipation built with each new Pokemon they introduced in all of the Gen 3 material. So even if you never heard of Gen 4's development, you knew that something was coming. This was also the heyday of the Pokemon Ranger offshoots and continued financial success of the Mystery Dungeon games. Not to mention that Pokemon Fitbit they gave out in the box before it was cool, Gen 4 was a magnificent time both to live through and to play even to this day. There's a specific charm that was perfectly captured here, to the point that fan games still emulate this style. That Gen 4 charisma was blended with the best mechanics of that era. And maybe that's part of why I love it so much, because it's just pure Pokemon without any of the gimmicks that later games do to get in the way. The closest thing that Gen 4 has to a battle gimmick is the physical special split, which revolutionized combat in a much more meaningful way than Megas or Z-moves ever did. I cracked open Soul Silver a little while ago just on a whim, and it felt so natural, just like this was how Pokemon was meant to be experienced. What, do you think I'm overselling it? So those are my rankings for each generation of Pokemon. Number 5 is number 8, number 3 is number 7, number 1 is number 6, number 8 is number 5, number 2 is number 4, number 7 is number 3, number 6 is number 2, and number 4 is number 1. Got it? And do bear in mind, this is my own personal list, so be sure to let me know your rankings down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!